This is the Detroit Sports Podcast Network.
What's up, jerks?
Manning retired.
Which one?
Both.
I like kickers.
Put him on the board. Hausch Mazzoli. Got it. Championship.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Fantasy Nerds on the Detroit Sports Podcast Network, brought to you by the Fan Up Network. As always, I am Jason Jarvie. Follow me on Twitter at Jarvie the King, and it's another great week to talk about fantasy football. We're getting closer and closer to training camp and preseason starting, and soon enough it's going to be the first week of September, and football will be back, and it'll be so glorious. But up until then, we got to get ready. Drafts are going to be coming up pretty soon. We're already into the second week of July, so I got a lot of news for you, and I have my final around the league with the NFC East. I got some prep work for you, and I have another decree. So we'll start out with the news that will affect us fantasy owners. So to start out, we have Alshon Jeffrey with the Bears. They're saying that there's not a whole lot of hope that he's going to make a long-term deal with the Bears. So this could go one of two ways. It could linger over him and could affect him all year. But on the other hand, this could be really good for us. This is going to give him motivation to have a stellar season, a really great season, and just boost up his value so he can maximize his contract next year, whether he's re-signing with the Bears or whether he's going somewhere else. So that's something to definitely watch throughout training camp and into the beginning of the season. Next up, for LaShawn McCoy, the Pennsylvania Attorney General closes the investigation about a bar fight incident that happened back in February. And this is just great. It's good that it's not going to be hanging over LaShawn McCoy. And he won't have to deal with any potential suspensions, like you may have to look at with Le'Veon Bell. You never know if that guy. There was rumors that came out that he missed a drug test, but he said that he didn't do anything wrong. So with LaShawn McCoy, it's great to know that there's nothing hanging over his head, and you can draft him accordingly. C.J. Anderson from the Denver Broncos saying that from everything that he's seen in training camp, they are going to be a run-first team. You know, this is a team that they don't have Peyton Manning anymore. They weren't able to sign Brock Osweiler in the offseason, so they're relying on inexperienced or bad quarterbacks. So they went out, they actually drafted a fullback, and from what they've seen in practices, they've been running a whole lot of two-set offense. So, and that's really how you want to build, a team that's coming off the Super Bowl. That's how you want to stay in shape and build your team. You already have a really good defense, and if you can have a really successful running game, then that's the model of success. And I think C.J. Anderson, Ronnie Hillman, they're both. It's gonna be a two-headed monster, but I'm not sure if they can succeed. But to stay with the Broncos and on that quarterback situation, from the Denver Post, they're saying that Trevor Siemian is a really close second behind Mark Sanchez, which either this is good news because they have this gem in Siemian, or it's bad news because Mark Sanchez is so bad that he can't get the job done, and that they may have to give it to this guy who maybe he's okay, but maybe he's not. If you want to take the positive side of this, you want to look at Trevor Siemian and say they drafted this guy and he's going to be a really good quarterback, and maybe he can be that stopgap because you spent a really high draft pick on Paxton Lynch. So until Lynch gets ready to take over the franchise, that Siemian may be able to be that stopgap. And when Lynch is ready, you'd have some trade bait. You can trade Trevor Siemian and add to your team. I'm not sure what the answer is. I tend to believe that Mark Sanchez will likely still be the starter, but you never know. We've seen crazier things, like we saw in Seattle a couple years ago. They went out, they signed Matt Flynn to a gigantic contract because of one game against the Lions, and then they drafted Russell Wilson, and Wilson outright won the job, and it's been history ever since. On the Browns, Isaiah Crowell apparently could be looking at a breakout season, which I don't get really positive about the Browns at all. And that's, there's a couple teams that when I'm drafting, if I see the team name, I see the Browns, I'm likely not going to draft that player. There are a couple players on that team now who interest me, like Duke Johnson, like Corey Coleman, and you may have to, and depending on where you are in the draft, you may have to put Isaiah Crowell in there. New head coach Hugh Jackson, they're going to have to run the ball a ton because their quarterback situation is just, it's so bad. If you look at the Broncos situation, and I think they would much rather be in that situation because they're relying on Robert Griffin III right now, who has not played at a high level in a pretty long time. I don't think it's too far to say, Hugh Jackson in Cincinnati, he had the similar, the thunder and lightning with Jeremy Hill being the runner and Giovanni Bernard being the pass-catching scat back. And they have a similar situation now with Isaiah Crowell being that true running back and Duke Johnson being the pass catch, the pass threat out of the backfield. So still, it's going to be the Browns. And I'm not sure if the big thing about having a pass-catching running back is having a quarterback who can actually get the ball to you in the flat. So with the success of the quarterback will come the success of the running back. And that could be a long time. You're might have to wait until, the next couple quarterbacks go through the Browns. Going over to the West Coast, in Chargers camp, Travis Benjamin injured during the final practice of their spring session. It's an undisclosed injury, but they're saying that it's likely not going to be too significant, which is very important because he's going to be taking over that second wide receiver role. Keenan Allen coming back from his injury, he's the main guy, and Travis Benjamin is going to be the player that they count on to try and stretch the field. Obviously, Phillip Rivers still loves the tight end. He's always going to try and get it to Antonio Gates, and they still have Stevie Johnson. But this is really Travis Benjamin's chance to have a breakout season. Last year he kind of made some waves in Cleveland, but I think coming here with a better quarterback, I think it's a better opportunity. And I think we could see a really good wide receiver emerge, or we could just see Travis Benjamin go back into being nothing. The last bit of news I have for you comes in the way of a deep sleeper that you're going to want to keep an eye on for your drafts. And it just so happens to come out of my hometown in Detroit. They're saying that wide receiver TJ Jones is seeing time in the slot with the first team offense. So Jones last year, he was a 6th round player out of Notre Dame, wound up on the PUP list for the majority of the season, and finished December though, catching 9 balls, 121 yards, and a touchdown. Everyone has been raving about him. The offensive coordinator, Matt Stafford, has been saying that TJ Jones has the ability to have a breakout year. So this is a guy that you want to keep an eye on. And I'm not saying you're going to draft him super high, but if you have space on your roster at the end of your draft, TJ Jones might not be a bad guy to look at, just in case he does have a breakout season. Because Matthew Stafford does have the ability to throw the ball around. They have Golden Tate. They have Marvin Jones. And I think there's enough there for TJ Jones to be productive. Obviously, you want to hope that Eric Ebron is going to develop into a better tight end and more of like that pass-catching tight end like we see in Rob Gronkowski or Greg Olsen. But in case that doesn't happen, there's something to be said about Matthew Stafford feeling comfortable with a guy. And if he can get comfortable with TJ Jones, he could have a pretty decent season. So that wraps up the news portion of the podcast. And we're going to move on to my Around the League segment, where I've gone over all the different divisions in the NFL, and I've previewed all the teams and all the players that you should be looking at. And we're finally at our last division, the NFC East. And I didn't save them for any particular reason. It just kind of happened that way. They were a bad division last year, but there are some interesting fantasy players just in this division. Starting out with the team who won the division last year, the Washington Redskins. Surprisingly enough, they finished at 9-7, and they were really the best of a bad bunch of teams last year. They were led by Kirk Cousins, also being from Michigan and being a huge Michigan State fan. That was a very it was vindicative for me, seeing him really do good last year. He struggled pretty early last season, going 2-4, but he finished out the season going 7-3, got him into the playoffs. He limited his turnovers. He probably helped out some teams last year, but right now he's not a starting fantasy quarterback, but he could be a really dependable guy. He could be that quarterback that you draft somewhere in the middle part of your draft, and if the starting quarterback that you drafted didn't work out, Kirk Cousins is going to help you out a lot, and you're gonna love having him on your team. At running back, the Alfred Morris experiment is finally over. You can take him off your board, and they're putting all their hopes into Matt Jones, and he's going to be the star there, right? He's had some fumbling issues, which always is a killer for starting running backs, because if you fumble one too many times, you're going to be seeing the bench a lot. But if Matt Jones can fix that problem, he has the ability to be a pretty decent number one running back. He's more than likely a low-end running back too, with a fair amount of upside, but I don't want to really depend on him too much in the season. Behind him, you have Chris Thompson, who will likely be a third down back, and he could be kind of an interesting PPR player. And then even behind him is an even more interesting player, though, is rookie Keith Marshall, who he would look more like a starter if Matt Jones was to go downs, more than Chris Thompson. So Keith Marshall may actually be an interesting late-round guy to pick up. Really, both Chris Thompson and Keith Marshall, because Thompson has the PPR value, but Keith Marshall would probably be the guy the Redskins would go to if Matt Jones can't get the job done. At wide receiver, they have a ton of weapons there. Like a lot of teams where they just have a girth of wide receivers, it's going to be hard to find which one is going to be the guy who breaks out that game. But even still, even with all those weapons of wide receiver, they're not even the top threat. The tight end is the top threat on this team. So you got Pierre Garçon and Deshaun Jackson. Those are the leaders on this team for the receivers. Pierre Garçon is more of a dependable route runner, where you got Deshaun Jackson. He's a deep threat, and he's going to be boom or bust. But you gotta draft him, and you're probably gonna have to ride him a lot of games as either your starting wide receiver or your second wide receiver. Beyond him, you had Jamison Crowder, and he stepped in when Deshaun Jackson was hurt last year. He was decent, but they went out and spent a high draft pick on TCU's Josh Doxson. But really, barring any significant injuries in this group, I would go. I know some people don't see it this way, but I really think Pierre Garçon is still the main receiving threat, because when Deshaun Jackson was out last year, Garçon got a ton of targets. And even with a healthy Deshaun Jackson, I think Garçon is your most dependable wide receiver. After him, you got Deshaun Jackson, and then I would go Josh Doxson and Jamison Crowder. Another reason why I would put Jackson behind Garçon is because he's always due for a hamstring injury at some point. And then their biggest receiving option, not a wide receiver, their tight end, Jordan Reed. And he could arguably be the best tight end in the league. But in the 3 years that he's played, he hasn't played a full season ever, which it kills fantasy people. It kills fantasy owners. It loses you games when you depend on a guy like Jordan Reed. It hurts when you have to go to the waiver wire and pick up Joe Schmo from the Texans, CJ Fedorowicz, or whoever you want to pick up. But with the way that he scores, even if he doesn't play a full season, he's likely going to be a top 10 tight end this year. And if he does stay healthy, he has that potential, I think, to unseat Rob Gronkowski as the top scoring tight end for fantasy. So to recap the Washington Redskins, Kirk Cousins, I would look for him somewhere in the mid to late rounds. You're not going to draft him to be your starter, but if you're looking for that backup, that really solid backup for your team, maybe you got one of the lower tier quarterbacks of the starters, Kirk Cousins wouldn't be a bad idea to have that dependable backup. Matt Jones, I would start looking for him somewhere in the 6th round. He may go a little higher just because he is a starting running back, but I'd feel the most comfortable 6th round or below that. And then for Chris Thompson and Keith Marshall, I'd look anywhere from the mid to late rounds, and especially with Keith Marshall in the late round, I would look for him as a flyer player, somebody that you want to stash on your team who could have a high upside. You look at what happened in Arizona last year. They had Chris Johnson and Andre Ellington, and David Johnson came out of. I think they knew that he was going to be a good player, but for fantasy players, he came out of nowhere and was really productive, and now he's viewed as one of the top fantasy running backs. So Keith Marshall does have that ability. At wide receiver, Pierre Garçon, Deshaun Jackson, I'd look probably starting in the 8th or 9th round, just because you're never sure who's going to be the option there, who's going to have the big game each week. So 8th, 9th round, I look for both of those guys. Josh Doxson, I'd look a little bit later, maybe in the 12th round. And Jamison Crowder, you can let him go undrafted, or if you're just looking for depth on your team, I would look in the late rounds if you're going to draft him. And then Jordan Reed, because of his ability and because of how a high-scoring tight end can change your fantasy game, Jordan Reed, I would draft him as high as the 3rd round because he has that X factor. He can score you touchdowns, and he can change a game for you. And that wraps up the Redskins. Moving on now to the second place team, which, really surprising, the Philadelphia Eagles. As bad as they were, finishing 7-9, they still finished second in this division. Now they got rid of Chip Kelly, brought in new head coach Doug Peterson, has some history there. He was an assistant under Andy Reid, went with him to Kansas City, and now he is the head coach of the Philadelphia Eagles, which some say that's a good thing, but I think there's going to be some growing pains there. And there's definitely a mess. Just looking at the top position of your team, there's a mess at quarterback. They have Sam Bradford, who they signed to a contract that he no way deserved. There's no way that I would have ever imagined paying him the amount of money they paid him. They overpaid on a backup quarterback in Chase Daniel, and then they went out in the draft and they drafted Carson Wentz with the 2nd overall pick. It doesn't really make a whole lot of sense unless they really believe Carson Wentz is going to be their savior quarterback, which they have to hope that at this point. But barring an injury, Sam Bradford will likely be the starter for the season. But as we've seen before, Bradford is injury prone. He's always injury prone. He's going to get banged up. He's going to miss at least a game here or there. And then I think it'll be a toss-up to be who's going to be that quarterback. Are they going to give the shot to Carson Wentz, or are they going to hand it off to Chase Daniel? But anyway, I don't want any of these guys to be my starting quarterback. I don't even want these guys to be my backup quarterback on my fantasy team. I would let these guys go undrafted. But if you are desperate for quarterback help in your draft, say some guy went crazy and drafted 4 quarterbacks on his team, obviously you're going to look at Sam Bradford. But I wouldn't, if you're at the point where you have to draft Sam Bradford as your backup, I would let him go until one of the last couple rounds. Now, running back last year, kind of like quarterback, was a mess. They had signed DeMarco Murray, they signed Ryan Matthews, they had Darren Sproles, and just didn't seem like they knew what they were doing. DeMarco Murray did not fit the system at all, and he's out of there. And Ryan Matthews he has the starting job. And when healthy, he can be a pretty dependable running back too. I wouldn't want him to be my main running back that I'm banking on scoring 10 to 15, 20 points a game. But he can be that running back too, that flex option who can give you a decent outing to help you win a game. But you have to keep in mind, he's injury prone. After him, you got Darren Sproles. His value shoots way up in PPR leagues. But in a standard league, he doesn't have a ton of value. And then, beyond Sproles, I say it's a toss-up. You have probably the best option after them would be rookie Byron Marshall. But if you're looking for a backup, if you have Ryan Matthews and you're looking for a backup, there's likely going to be somebody else out on the waiver wire who is better than Byron Marshall that you could plug into your team. At wide receiver, they have some interesting players, but kind of like with the Browns and their running back, their production is going to depend on quarterback play. If Sam Bradford or Chase Daniels or Carson Wentz can actually get them the ball. Now, the top wide receiver there, Jordan Matthews, he's still going to perform. I'd probably rank him a low-end wide receiver too, a decent flex play. But if he had a better quarterback, Jordan Matthews has the ability to be probably more of a low-end number one wide receiver. But on this team, as constructed, I would put him no better than a wide receiver too. They went out and they signed Ruben Randall, who I liked him on the Giants, and I think if he's essentially been brought in to stretch the field, and that's going to be the big thing. Are the quarterbacks going to be able to get him the ball so he can actually do something? So Ruben Randall, I'd probably only want him right now as a flex play. Maybe as your immediate backup at wide receiver. And then after that, you have Josh Huff, who has shown flashes but hasn't really stepped into fantasy relevance. And the guy that I talked up so much last year, Nelson Aguilar, his future, I think it's up in the air. He's had a whole lot of off the field issues, and I'm not sure if you draft him this year, which sucks because last year I was just hyping him up so much and calling him the Odell Beckham of this draft, and he fell flat on the floor. He's definitely not going to make my King's Decree this year. So of those two guys, Josh Huff, I might look in the late round of your draft, but other than that, I don't like it. And then at tight end, you got Zach Ertz, who's a pretty dependable tight end. He's not going to score like Rob Gronkowski or Jordan Reed, but he's right there at the bottom of the top 10 of tight ends. You don't expect a lot from him, but he's going to give you some decent outings. It's not going to be flashy, but it's kind of like the guy from Pittsburgh who's there for forever, who you didn't expect it to come from him, but he just got it done every single week. So Zach Ertz, he's the low end of the starting tight ends, and I would draft him accordingly. So to wrap up the Philadelphia Eagles, Sam Bradford, Chase Daniel, Carson Wentz, I'm not drafting any of those guys. If you have to, Sam Bradford, wait until the very last couple rounds. And even if you do miss out on Sam Bradford, I wouldn't be that disappointed. I would rather going to the season with one quarterback on my roster than have to draft Sam Bradford higher than is necessary. Running back, Ryan Matthews, he has the ability to be a productive fantasy running back, and I would draft him probably in as high as the 5th round. I'd feel better drafting in the 6th round, but as high as the 5th round. After him, Darren Sproles probably falls to the mid to later rounds in the majority of drafts, but if you are in a PPR league, I would bump him up as high as the 7th round, because even though this is a change in offense, there's still a role for him in this offense. He's going to be that pass-catching threat out of the backfield. But that's only in PPR leagues. Otherwise, Darren Sproles in standard leagues, I think he falls to middle to later rounds. And then I would let any other Philadelphia running back go undrafted. For Jordan Matthews, with ability, you could draft him higher, but where I feel comfortable drafting him is the 7th round, because he's going to be my wide receiver 2, and there's got to be other options that are probably on better teams before him, so that's why he drafts so low. Ruben Randall, because he's a boomer bust player, I put him at the 10th round, right around there. And then, as I said, Josh Huff, he's a late round guy if you're looking to fill your team. And then Nelson Aguilar, unless everything clears up with him and he shows a lot of potential in preseason games, I would just let him go undrafted. And then Zach Ertz, I'm looking middle to late rounds. He's that tight end. He's the last guy. He's like the last starting tight end that should be drafted. So that wraps up the Philadelphia Eagles. I'm going to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll wrap up the NFC East. I got some fantasy prep advice, and I got the King's Decree. You're listening to the Fantasy Nerds on the Detroit Sports Podcast Network. The Fantasy Nerd Show is sponsored by the Fan Up Network. They've developed the ultimate fantasy football app. It's a one-stop shop for everything you need. You can track teams and scores across multiple platforms, get latest injury and player news, and access to expert advice. See the hot trends with waiver pickups and drops. It has everything you need to manage all your fantasy football teams. Android users can get the app in the Play Store, and an iPhone version is now available in the App Store. Go to fanupnetwork.com to learn more and follow them on Twitter at fanupnetwork. Welcome back to the Fantasy Nerd Show. We're wrapping up around the league, and I'll finish up the NFC East, starting with the New York Giants. Finished 3rd last season in the East. They finished 6-10. They scored, though, the 6th most points in the league. Their biggest problem as a team, though, is that they gave up the 2nd most points. So they are actually a pretty decent team fantasy-wise. Eli Manning, their quarterback, similar to Kirk Cousins. Now, I know Eli Manning has 2 Super Bowls, which is a lot better than Kirk Cousins. But fantasy-wise, he is similar to Kirk Cousins in that he is a dependable player, but he's not the guy that you want to be your starting quarterback. There's going to be other quarterbacks who they're just going to put up more points than him. That's just how it's going to be. But he's a very good backup quarterback fantasy-wise, and if need be, he could carry your team. And if you have to deal with an injury early in the season, Eli Manning could carry your team. And there's going to be weeks even that Eli Manning outperforms whoever your starter is. So it's a blessing and it's a curse, because if you're on one of those weeks where Eli Manning goes for 5 touchdowns and he's sitting on your bench, it hurts. But it definitely is better to have him on your bench than have him on another guy's roster going up against you. At running back, it's a little bit unclear. Rashad Jennings, you always have to wonder if he's going to stay healthy. But just like Eli Manning, I think he's a really good backup running back fantasy wise. And I'd put him at a low end running back too. If he could ever stay healthy, he could be a pretty decent running back. But the stats don't lie. He's never rushed for over 900 yards. The most touchdowns he's ever had in a season is 6, and he's not a huge receiving threat. He's not a guy who's going to wow you with numbers fantasy-wise. He's dependable, but I don't want to rely on him to be my starting running back. And beyond him, you have a bunch of guys who are also just unproven. You have Shane Vereen and Andre Williams, who they haven't done a whole lot. And if Jennings is out, like I've said with a lot of these backup running backs, is that there's likely going to be other players that I'd rather have over Vereen or Williams. The one guy that I would, if I had to pick one or the other, I'd probably pick Shane Vereen, just because I'm in more PPR leagues, and Shane Vereen he's a PPR running back. That's where his value is. But this team it's not gonna confuse people. They're a passing team, kind of like the Lions. They don't really have a decent running game, and they're gonna make their money through the air, and they have the wide receiver to do it. Odell Beckham, the dude's a stud. Ever since he came in the league, it took him he had some injury troubles early on, but once he started going, he's a stud. He's a top 5 wide receiver, and you should draft him as such. As I've been saying all along this season, the NFL is moving to a passing league, and it's going to be moving like that in fantasy as well. You're going to get more points out of your wide receivers than you would a stud running back, unlike the days of past. So Odell Beckham, he's going to be drafted very high. He's going to be the main target for Eli Manning, and barring an injury, he's going to be consistent. And even if he is hurt, it's going to be he's going to be still a solid wide receiver. After him, it's kind of a toss-up between Victor Cruz, who hasn't played in a year and a half, and then rookie wide receiver Sterling Shepard, who doesn't have elite ability, but he's a very solid route runner, which is probably what they're going to try and depend on. If Victor Cruz is 100%, it could get scary in New York. Good things could really happen if you have Odell Beckham on one side and you have Victor Cruz on the other side, because Victor Cruz isn't that far removed from being viewed as one of the best up-and-coming wide receivers. Obviously, he got hurt, and things haven't really worked out as well. But if he's 100% healthy, it could be really good for Victor Cruz and Odell Beckham Jr. But, if Sterling Shepard has to be that second wide receiver, he's going to be okay, but I think there is definitely going to be a learning curve. It's always hard for rookie wide receivers, unless you're an absolute phenom like Odell Beckham. Sterling Shepard isn't a guy that I really want to depend on, though, as a fantasy wide receiver. And beyond him, with no more Ruben Randall, Dwayne Harris, the only way he becomes relevant is if one or possibly even two of those guys go down. He had a decent season last year because Victor Cruz and Ruben Randall were injured for parts of the season, but with the 3 other wide receivers, Cruz, OBJ, and Sterling Shepard, Dwayne Harris doesn't really fit too much. He might have 1 or 2 games here or there, but that's not something that I really want to rely on. And then for tight ends, unless you're in a league where you have to start 2 tight ends, Will Tye and Larry Donnell are likely going to be just sitting on the waiver wire, waiting to be picked up for bye week fill-ins. If I had to choose between one of those guys, Will Tye, he was kind of interesting last season, but it's not interesting enough for me to draft him, even as a backup tight end for me. I'm going to let him sit on the waiver wire, and when I need my waiver wire tight end, because I usually only draft 1 tight end in my leagues, then I might take a look at Will Tye. So to wrap up the Giants, Eli Manning, I'd look for him in the mid to late rounds, kind of like Kirk Cousins. If you draft one of those lower tier starting quarterbacks, Eli Manning is a great quarterback to pick up, and to anchor that bench of your team. Rashad Jennings, even though I'm not too high on him, because he's a starting running back, you still have to draft him pretty high. So I'd feel comfortable in the 7th round. I don't want to reach on him. There's likely other wide receivers that I'd rather have. I draft earlier before taking a shot at Rashad Jennings. So 7th round or later, I'd feel comfortable. And then for the other 2 guys, Shane Vereen, Andre Williams, I'm gonna let him go. I'm gonna let him go till really late, or even let him go undrafted. Odell Beckham, he's likely going to go in the 1st round in a lot of leagues, because I think a lot of people are moving towards the wide receiver movement. He's one of the top 5 wide receivers. You can arguably put him in the top 3. So he's going to go in the 1st round. I'd probably put him in the lower half of that 1st round. If you are to get him, though, in the 2nd round, you've gotten an absolute steal. Victor Cruz, if he's fully healthy, I would draft him probably in the 9th round, and I think he could be a steal there, because he has that ability to be I'd put him in the top 20 of wide receivers if he's fully healthy and kind of working together with Odell Beckham. Sterling Shepard, I'd probably put him even later. I have on my sheet right here 11th round, but if Cruz is fully healthy, I drop him down even lower, because Cruz is going to eat up receptions. Odell Beckham is going to eat up receptions. There's not going to be a ton for Sterling Shepard. So only if he is a part of that offense, I draft him higher, but I probably look at him more in the later part of your draft. And then Dwayne Harris, I let him go undrafted. Let him sit on the waiver wire, and he'll be the waiver wire pickup. He might be the first couple weeks, the hot guy on the waiver wire. Maybe Eli Manning was tired of throwing to Odell Beckham, and he threw a touchdown or 2 to Dwayne Harris. So I'd let him go undrafted. And the same with both of the tight ends. Will Tye, Larry Donnell, let them go undrafted. There's other tight ends out there that you can draft that will be more productive for you. So finally coming to the last team in the NFC East, which could arguably be the best team this year, and definitely has the ability, the Dallas Cowboys. Finished 4-12 last year, but they were decimated by injuries. Romo was out for a good portion of the season. Dez Bryant was hurt, and when he was playing, he was probably playing hurt, and they lost their solid, dependable running back in DeMarco Murray. But I think things are looking up in Dallas this year. Tony Romo, when healthy, he has the ability to be a top 10 quarterback fantasy-wise, but you're just not sure if he can stay healthy. It used to be Romo would go a couple seasons healthy, and then he'd miss the majority of his season. And I think we're at a point now where he's just probably always going to be playing hurt, kind of like Peyton Manning. That dude is always playing hurt. The bad thing with Tony Romo is his main injury is his back, and that is something that's so touchy. And if it's not right, if his back isn't right, even if he can still play through it, it's going to be hard for him. So if he can stay healthy, he has that ability to be a top quarterback. And even if he is a lower tier, even if he is hurt, he's going to help out the rest of his team. Now, the most exciting player for fantasy owners at this year's NFL draft, it had to be Ezekiel Elliott. When he got drafted by the Dallas Cowboys, I mean, he immediately shot up to people's draft boards. People are going crazy over him. I mean, they already have him ranked as the top in the top 5 for running backs, which, last year people were saying, drafting Todd Gurley too high was kind of crazy. When Amir Abdullah kind of flashed in the preseason, and then he shot up to as high as the 4th round, people were going way crazy. But they're saying Ezekiel Elliott already a top 5 fantasy running back. Now, I definitely think he has the ability. I'm not, can he do it? And that's going to be the biggest thing. Can he make the transition from college to the NFL? At the high end of his potential, he could be the best fantasy running back. no doubt. But what we have to see, a lot of the hype has to go around running behind arguably the best offensive line in at least in my recent history, if not in all time of football. They have a gigantic offensive line. Just like when they had Emmitt Smith, he had a huge offensive line to run behind. It's similar right now. And if Darren McFadden last year can run over 1,000 yards, Ezekiel Elliott, he shouldn't have any trouble doing that, right? He's still a rookie, but he's going to be drafted super high. Behind him, you have Darren McFadden and Lance Dunbar, who really aren't going to be too relevant because Ezekiel Elliott is an all-down back. He's a runner, and he's also the pass-catching guy. Unless he goes down or unless he just needs a breather, McFadden isn't going to be he's not going to be relevant. But I would advise, if you draft Elliott, to get McFadden as a handcuff, just in case something happens with him, if he's hurt or if he can't if he's not making that transition as early as possible. And then Lance Dunbar, I would probably either save him for way late in draft or just let him go on the waiver wire. At wide receiver, Dez Bryant. I think he's probably the most disrespected wide receiver right now. And you can use that to your advantage in fantasy drafts this year. He's still rated in the top 10, but a lot of the experts have him in the low top 10, like 8th or 9th. And, he was hurt for 7 games last year. He didn't have Tony Romo for many of the games that he did play. But I think Dez Bryant, he will be a top 5 wide receiver this year. And, with fantasy experts ranking him so low, I think you can get a decent price on him. You don't want to wait too long, but he has that ability. After him, Terrence Williams and Cole Beasley are okay. They're not fantasy starters, though. They are worthy of being drafted, of being a filler on your bench. If you're just looking for backup wide receivers, of guys who have potential to, have numbers if there are injuries on their team. Those are 2 guys who have already proved that they can do it. But they're really nothing more than filler. I don't want to depend on them to be starters. And at tight end, you have the always dependable Jason Witten. He's another year older, but he hasn't shown a ton of signs of slowing down. He hasn't had too many injuries, and I think he's gonna scrap this year to remain in the top 10 of tight ends. And I would draft him accordingly. I think he still is good enough to be a starter in fantasy, and let people go out and draft Rob Gronkowski, Jordan Reed. If you're not a big fan of reaching for tight ends, let those guys draft the top guys and let Jason Witten fall to you, and then you'll be set because Witten is a dependable guy. So to wrap up the Dallas Cowboys, Tony Romo, I'd probably look at him in the middle rounds. I'd put him a step above Kirk Cousins and Eli Manning because when he's healthy, he can be a top 10 starting fantasy quarterback. But he's still in the middle rounds. I don't want him to be my starter. If that's the guy who you get stuck with, you better make sure that you get a dependable backup. Ezekiel Elliott, people are drafting him as high as first round, and that's where I put him. Probably in the lower parts of that first round. If you get him in the second round, good for you. But more than likely, he's going the first round. Darren McFadden, I'd probably put him in the 9th round, probably in the middle of your draft. If you did draft Ezekiel Elliott, I might spend a little higher and get that handcuff just in case something goes wrong with him. And then Lance Dunbar, I'd let him go undrafted. For Dez Bryant, second round is going to be a steal, but if he somehow falls to you in the 3rd round, that's amazing value for you. You're getting arguably a top 5 wide receiver in the 3rd round when the top guys have already gone in the higher parts of the 1st round. And then Terrence Williams and Cole Beasley, I look for them anywhere in the middle to late rounds of your draft when you're looking to fill out your roster. And then Jason Witten, I look for him somewhere in the middle rounds, and you're going to want to draft him after all those big name tight ends. Rob Gronkowski, Jordan Reed, Greg Olsen, Delaney Walker. After all those guys have gone, Jason Witten is going to be your dependable starting tight end to draft. So that wraps up around the league. We've covered all the divisions now, and we're going to move on to my fantasy prep of the week. And last week, I suggested that you should know what players you want to draft going into the draft. You want to target some players. And my advice for you this week is to really know what kind of league you're in so you can plan accordingly. So it's really important to know the ins and outs of your league. Because just as an example, Antonio Brown, he's still going to be the top wide receiver in drafts. Adrian Peterson is still going to be one of the top running backs in the draft. But if you're in a PPR league, guys like Darren Sproles, even Theo Riddick, they have a ton more value than you may think of. In a standard league, Sproles, Riddick, other pass-catching running backs can be forgotten. But in PPR, if you're getting 1 point per reception, those guys can really swing games for you. A couple of years ago when we did really start doing PPR, Darren Sproles came out of nowhere. He had like an 80-catch season with the Saints, and he was the top running back, which really you don't, when you see Darren Sproles, he's a small dude. He doesn't look like a typical running back. Compare him to Adrian Peterson, and AP all day is going to be the top running back. But in a PPR league, if you're a running back who, if they can catch 50 balls, they deserve to have a spot in your team. If anything, they're really good flex play. That's why guys like Le'Veon Bell are so valuable, because they have the best of both worlds. He can run the ball, but he also catches a ton of catches. So know your scoring system. And, good leagues, they try to even out the scoring. Quarterbacks, running backs, wide receivers, they usually all kind of even out. So there's no glaring, glitch in your league. But if your league gives more points consistently to one position, you really need to put more importance on that position. If you get a ton of points for receptions, wide receivers definitely have to get the nod in your league. If you're in a league where you, for some reason, give points for carries, you look at the guys who get a ton of carries, and those running backs have more value in that league. I was in a league where we drafted IDPs, individual defensive players, and there were times really that linebackers could at times score as high or higher than starting running backs. So in that league, IDPs had to be drafted accordingly. You saw guys like Patrick Willis, who they had like 120 to 140 tackles a season, go as high in like the 4th or 5th round. Last year I was in a 2-quarterback league, and if you had 2 stud quarterbacks, that essentially guaranteed you a path to the playoff. So when you're planning for your draft, know the scoring system and what players score the highest in your league so you can get a leg up. So that about wraps up the episode, and it's time for me to give you my King's Decree. So last week I told you that Rob Gronkowski not going to be the top tight end this year. And I'm going to follow that up with another tight end, a guy who's going to come back this season. And my decree this week is that Julius Thomas will be a top 5 tight end again. Right now, he's sitting right around the bottom 10 to even the 11th or 12th. But when he's healthy, he really is one of the best tight ends in the game. And then you look at what offense he's on. That offense, that Jacksonville offense, is poised for a big jump this year. Blake Bortles is an emerging superstar quarterback. Allen Robinson and Allen Hurns are two big receiving threats. TJ Yeldon is a great pass-catching running back. And they signed Chris Ivory, who is he proved last year that he could be a dependable running back. So you look at what the situation that he's in, and look at when Julius Thomas did succeed, was when he was in Denver, when there was Demaryius Thomas and Wes Welker, and they had a decent running back. It's going to be a good situation for Julius Thomas. He's going to be able to carve out his slice of the pie. He's going to get his points. And so if he can stay healthy, I think Julius Thomas can easily get over 800 yards, get 8+ touchdowns, but that's going to be the key. And I'm going to be banking on him this year, and Julius Thomas will be a top 5 tight end again, and that is the King's decree. That wraps up this episode of the Fantasy Nerds. It's been great spending some time with you, and we finished around the league, and next week I think we're really going to start diving into players and where you should draft them, looking at some sleepers, looking at some busts, and as always, we'll have another King's Decree. I'll have more news, but that's going to do it for me. I am Jason Jarvie. Follow me on Twitter, @JarvieTheKing, and until next week, later, nerds.